From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Senator Joe Manchin pulls his permitting proposal from a bill to fund the government as the first lawsuit is filed against President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Kim Strassel and Alicia Finley. Welcome to you both. With a deadline to fund the government looming only days away, Senator Joe Manchin found himself on Tuesday unable to round up enough support for his promised permitting reform deal, which was pulled from the continuing resolution to fund the government. And let's listen to Majority Leader Chuck Schumer in the Senate announcing this decision.
Senate Republicans have made very clear they will block legislation to fund the government if it includes bipartisan permitting reform, because they've chosen to obstruct instead of work in a bipartisan way to achieve something they've long claimed they wanted to do. Because American families should not be subject to a Republican-manufactured government shutdown, Senator Manchin has requested, and I have agreed, to move forward and pass the recently filed continuing resolution legislation without the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2022. Senator Manchin, myself, and others will continue to have conversations about the best way to ensure responsible permitting reform is passed before the end of the year.
Kim, what has happened here? Because last I checked, Democrats control the House of Representatives, Democrats control the Senate, and didn't Chuck Schumer promise Joe Manchin that he would get this permitting deal done?
Yeah. Well, here's a few things that were wrong in that Schumer statement. So for beginners, in order to pass this continuing resolution to fund the government, you need 60 votes. And while he sat there and lectured that this was a bipartisan bill, the reality is that he didn't even have all the Democrats on board with this. Bernie Sanders had already come out and said he was opposed to it. Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey had also come out and said he was opposed, which means that Republicans would have had to fill in the gap. And you would have had to have had at least 12 of them say yes. And while there were a couple that were willing to go along, many of them were very opposed to this bill because it was not bipartisan. Notably, when Senator Manchin wrote an op-ed on our pages a few days ago, he was very careful with his words. And he said, this bill is bipartisan. Republicans have had lots of input into the substance of what makes up this bill, meaning he was claiming that he'd drawn on some of their ideas, but he certainly didn't negotiate with any of them over this. And in fact, they had a bill of their own put forward by the other West Virginia Senator, Shelley Moore Capito. Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, whipped very hard on this because he felt that the GOP product was much better. And there's some other things that went into it too. But the bottom line is this was meant to be a clean funding bill to keep the government open. Chuck Schumer attempted to hitch this priority of Manchin's onto it because it was something that was promised as part of the last reconciliation deal, and the gambit failed.
And Alicia, can you take us through some of the policy details? Because it seems to me Republicans were objecting in two ways. One, they were saying that the Manchin proposal didn't go far enough to solving the permitting problem that America faces. And two, that there were some things in the Manchin bill that went way too far. And the Journal had an editorial. The headline was Manchin's permitting bill has a poison pill. So can you just explain a little bit each of those objections from the Republican camp?
One of the objections was, as you said, that didn't go far enough, that it essentially set up a shot clock, so to speak, 2 years for regulatory agencies to complete the environmental reviews for bigger projects, 1 year for small projects. This was actually incorporated in the bipartisan infrastructure bill last year for transportation projects. And so this would apply it to, or these same deadlines for energy projects. One problem with this is that nothing compels the agencies to meet these targets or deadlines. And in fact, the bill concluded a savings clause saying that nothing here shall override or change NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, that sets out the procedures for completing environmental reviews and requires these federal agencies to dot all their I's and to consider all the myriad environmental potential harms from these projects. So nothing in this Manchin bill would have changed NEPA in any way. It wouldn't have limited the litigation. It would have set up some kind of statute of limitations, 150 days for opponents to bring lawsuits. But most of the time, green groups actually sue immediately. So this actually wouldn't have cracked down on the litigation racket. And in some cases, maybe it would have prevented opponents from suing while projects were already under construction, but wouldn't have limited who can sue and actually how many times they could sue, get how many bites at the apple they can get. One idea I've kind of supported is that the loser pays. So if the environmentalists lose their lawsuits, that they'll have to pay for the cost, not just of the lawsuits and the litigation costs of the government, but also the uncertainty and the delays that it causes the developers, energy developers. There are two provisions in the bill that were problematic. One of the provisions would have allowed states, given them more discretion to block pipelines by revising the Clean Water Act provision to allow them to potentially block pipelines if they deem it could contribute to climate change and other indirect environmental harms, rather than merely the quote unquote discharges into waterways, which is the current law. Manchin announced early yesterday that they would actually dump that provision because it was problematic. But they didn't agree to dump this other provision that would have allowed the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to have broad power over the nation's grid. Right now, states under the Federal Power Act of 1935 permit interstate pipelines. There are historical reasons for this, but also any transmission line that goes through a state naturally connects to its grid and can alter its energy mix and will affect the balance of power, so to speak. So right now, states have this authority to permit or disapprove of transmission lines. And the Manchin bill would have allowed the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Energy Secretary to override this power if they were deemed to be in the national energy interest. And this was a very expansively interpreted to help intermittent, which is defined essentially as renewable energy, to increase their build out. This posed a number of problems for the states, for federalism, the constitutional federalism, and with the federal government basically coming in, telling states, well, you not only have to allow this transmission line be built through your states, you may also have to take this green energy from another state that could potentially drive out their own fossil fuels. I mean, we've been seeing this in other states, Texas, where you've had a lot of wind power come onto the grid thanks to actually a transmission line build out from West Texas. And that has actually pushed a lot of coal plants out of business and ergo has resulted in less reliable energy. But you would start to see these problems actually expand nationwide. And actually a particular region that could be harmed by this is, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, where they still have a lot of coal and nuclear, and which could be squeezed out by renewable build out in the mid-Atlantic coast.
Given these Republican criticisms of the Manchin proposal, one of the arguments I've heard from their side is that they didn't want to give up hope on a better permitting bill passing. And the theory was that if this Manchin thing were added to the government funding bill and signed into law, that it would check the permitting reform box. And who knows how long it would be until Congress got back to the issue where Republicans really think that we need substantive changes. But Kim, I also would not underrate the personal aspect of this and the anger among Republicans at Joe Manchin. And remember the sequencing of this here. Manchin had blocked Democrats from passing a big budget reconciliation spending bill. Then there was this CHIPS bill, this billion-dollar CHIPS bill that came up, and Republican leader Mitch McConnell had threatened to not vote for the CHIPS bill if Democrats were still going to do a reconciliation bill. Eventually what happened was Republicans did vote for that CHIPS bill, and then lo and behold, shortly thereafter, Joe Manchin made this deal and announced that he was for a reconciliation package after all. And so here's a quote from Texas Senator John Cornyn last week. He said, "Relationships are important around here, and I think people feel like he misled them. There's not a lot of sympathy on our side for providing Senator Manchin a reward for his flip-flop on the reconciliation." So, Kim, that may be part of it. And the other part of it may be, of course, the looming midterm elections in November. And maybe Republicans are thinking that there really is pressure and some Democrats who are interested in doing permitting reform. And there's a possibility we may take the House. There's a possibility we may take the Senate. And so maybe we can pass a better permitting reform bill next year, put it on Joe Biden's desk and ask him to sign it.
Yeah, I think a couple of political things were at play here. And you mentioned one of them. There is a lot of anger remaining among Republicans on Joe Manchin's approach and decisions on reconciliation. He had given many of them his promise, both publicly and privately, that he was not going to take any actions that increased the debt, risked greater inflation. And yet the pressure became so huge on him from the Democratic side that he threw all that overboard. And in the process, threw over a lot of trust that he built up with Republicans. And so, no, they weren't in a mood for this. But I think the even bigger point here is the latter one you made, Kyle, is that we are going into a midterm. And it was notable that even as things fell apart yesterday and Manchin was yanking his bill, one of the reasons he yanked it is because rather than have it officially voted down, he wanted to keep it in reserve for a potential future vehicle that maybe could get across the line. And he was said to be already talking with some Republican members about whether or not there was a way to merge or come to some sort of an agreement between the bill he has and the one that Republicans have put forward from Ms. Capito. So that's still a possibility. Now, it would be a very hard lift because environmentalists are opposed to any of this. And there are certainly a number of Democrats who are absolutely opposed to this too. But imagine a scenario in which you do get into a new Senate and Republicans have the majority. Is the pressure to get some of these projects done great enough that you could get, conversely, from the situation now, you could get 8 or 9 Democrats to come along, especially after if they potentially lost a midterm and are feeling bruised? Maybe. So this is more of a strategic point, I think, even more so than bruised feelings over reconciliation.